Okay, hello everybody. My name is Mark. This is Why I Hate the World, What's Happening. So we are continuing on with our exploration of far right-wing hate groups. And today we are talking about the history of the Ku Klux Klan. So, kind of the most, I would say, famous hate group in the United States, and definitely worth talking about if you want to get a nice, cohesive history of, hate groups. Right. So let's see here. Let me just go ahead and let's first take a look at what we're working on. These are our funny monsters, our goofy monsters that we've been coloring, recently. I think it's turning out pretty good. Maybe we'll continue with this and, maybe we'll put a background on it or something like that. So, anyhow, let's see here. Let's go ahead and get started. Ku Klux Klan. Alright, so... getting some coffee here. Okay. Where to start? So there's a kind of a, when you think Ku Klux Klan, you think, ignorant Southern jackasses running around in sheets burning crosses, right? Kind of thing. And, nowadays that's not too far off from the mark, right? Surprisingly, the Ku Klux Klan, though, did not really start out like that. So, let's see. First off, what are we going to make this little weird-looking dude over here? He should be some shade of green, you think? Yeah, let's make him sort of a weirdish, yellowish green. And also, if you're hearing loud music coming over the, over the line here, it's because my neighbor is, playing music all loud. So... I need to get me one of those noise-canceling microphones. Anyway, so yeah, the Ku Klux Klan. Well, we can't really talk about the history of the Klan without talking about American history, in particular, Reconstruction. So Reconstruction is that period during, right after the Civil War, where the southern, the former Confederacy, the southern states were occupied by the North and occupied by northern troops, and it was a period by which the basically political systems, the political governments and, economies of the South were reconstructed, right, essentially. And during this time, there was a lot of, first off, a lot of resentment, right, on the part of the southern states, the formerly defeated Confederate Army, essentially. Lots of resentment there, lots of, hate, right, going around because a lot of people came from the North, happened to be black. So a lot of people came from the North who ran for office in the South, who were appointed to political positions in the South in the new Reconstruction governments, things like that. A lot of Northern Republicans, right, and black people came down to the South to aid in Reconstruction, to take jobs, and something to keep in mind is that during this time, the Republicans, what we call Republicans and Democrats, were essentially the polar opposite of what they are today. The Democratic Party was the conservative party at this time in the, right after the Civil War, right? So they were, more closely ideologically aligned to today's Republicans. And the Republicans were more ideologically aligned to today's Democrats, right? So it was the Republican Party during this time that were anti-slavery, pro-civil rights, pro-union, right? Stuff like that, right? And it was the Democratic Party which was very much pro-white supremacy during this period in American history, and that kind of stayed the same. I mean, of course, there was already a pro-corporate wing, pro-business wing of the Republican Party at this time, and whatnot. But that kind of sort of stayed like that all the way up until around the 1940s or so, when they started to switch, and then it was civil rights in the 1960s, which you know, ultimately led to the parties switching ideological positions. So, but it was true, it was definitely true that the Democratic Party benefited a lot from white supremacist groups like the KKK and stuff like that. And at this time in history, the Democratic Party was the conservative party. They were the ones that were in supporting white supremacy, stuff like that. They were the ones they were basically the Confederacy, right? The old Confederacy, you know. So, anyway, there was a lot of resentment, yeah, in the South, of course, of this. They saw these Northerners coming down as interlopers, right? And then, you know, there was also a lot of hate. They would take Northern soldiers. They would enlist black freedmen to be Northern soldiers who would then go to the South and occupy the South. And then, of course, Southern white supremacist people, former slave owners and things, really, really resented that. Didn't like armed black people telling them what to do. Right? Didn't like black people running for office and voting. They didn't like former slaves. They call them freedmen, people who are former slaves. They didn't like freedmen voting, stuff like that, right? And so you got this movement during Reconstruction, political movement called the Redeemers, right? And the Redeemers were a coalition in the South who were basically the white ruling class, the former planting class, right? Landowners, stuff like that. Those are the people, and they basically they wanted to regain political power. Okay, so essentially the white elites, the former plantation owners, stuff like that, the former slave owners, people who were very much in support of white supremacy, right? Those were the Redeemers. And, as a little side note before we go on, because you'll hear a lot from right-wingers today and neo-Confederates and, the kind of people that defend Confederate statues and shit like that, saying that this was all about, history, and there's a big sort of misconception in these circles, the lost cause of the South and all that shit, right? Those types of people. Big misconception and basically a lie, saying that the Civil War was not about slavery and the Confederacy was not about racism and it wasn't about maintaining slavery and all that other shit. And it was really all about maintaining our way of life and defending our homes from Northern aggression, blah, 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 blah. And before we go any further, just that's all complete 100% grade A bullshit of the highest caliber. The reason why the South went to war was to preserve slavery. Right? It was to preserve slavery. It definitely was. And you'll see this if you go and if you read the declaration of war from any given state as to why they joined the Confederacy. 9 times out of 10 they'll list it in there. They'll list in their war declaration, right? Why they're like when each state would like secede from the Union and join the Confederacy and basically declare war on the United States, right? The reason all of these southern states gave for joining the Confederacy was, among those reasons, right, in almost every state, was the preservation of the institution of slavery, right? And more often than not, you'll see like it definitely had something to do with race. You'll see that things like maintaining white supremacy, shit like that. They'll actually say it, right? It'll actually be listed out in the reasons why they seceded from the Union. So And whenever you hear, some Prager University or some shit like that trying to claim the Civil War was not about maintaining, was not about preserving slavery, it wasn't about racism, you can safely ignore that shit because it's not true. Anyway, so Reconstruction was that period, during this sort of post-Civil War period, and where the white Southerners, right, the former Confederates, like, were very, very angry at the state governments being and laws and things being passed by who they saw as interlopers from the North, and that's where you get the term carpetbagger, right? Basically, they saw anybody, a carpetbagger was like kind of like a scam artist. That's kind of how we use it today. You'll say fucking scam artist, right? Carpetbagger, or scallywag was another one, right? Carpetbaggers were people who came from the North, who basically worked for Reconstruction, right? And the reason why they called them carpetbaggers is because they were essentially calling them scam artists. The idea that they were like kind of like dishonest people who didn't even really have, like, they couldn't even afford real luggage, so they carried all their stuff around in bags made out of cheap carpet. Right, stuff like that. Kind of like like, for example, people called Hillary Clinton a carpetbagger because she didn't live in New York and she just moved there to run for the Senate. She actually is from like Arkansas. Right? So that's how the modern usage of it today, but that's where it came from, right? And what it was that there was a basically a program during Reconstruction in order to give ex-slaves their own land to work on, right? And the program was to basically break up plantations and give some of the land to the slaves. I think I have it here. The name of that. It was Special Field Order Number 15, right? Enacted during the Civil War. That's where we get the term. If you've ever heard 40 acres and a mule, right? That's where that comes from. This was like part of the speech in order to promote this. We should give the freedmen, the ex-slaves, a chance to make a living, and every man gets a 40 acres and a mule in order to like establish himself, or blah 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 blah, and so what it was that the federal government was basically imposing really high taxes on former slave owners, specifically, people, plantation owners, stuff like that, right? And a lot of these people, because their slaves were gone, they got wiped out. They lost all their money. They don't have any labor anymore. If their land wasn't kind of destroyed during the war, if they managed to survive the war without their land being, ravaged and burned down, shit like that, now they lost their labor force, and now they can't make any money, right? And what it was that people came from the North, and they would basically buy up all this land for pennies on the dollar, right? Because, these people, like the former plantation owners, suddenly owed all these taxes on it, which is actually another reason why, even to this day, people in the South really hate taxes. It's funny, like, where all these attitudes come from, right? So, although people always hate taxes, but this is definitely one of those reasons that it sort of like has become ingrained into the right-wing psyche, right? So it was basically like these were sort of land grab schemes, kind of, sort of. And, you kind of have a point here. It's like, well, you're being forced to sell your land for really cheap, because if you don't sell it, the government's going to confiscate it from you because you can't afford to pay the taxes, because you don't have a labor force anymore, which is, still, that labor force was comprised of slaves, so it's like, maybe you should lose your fucking land. Right? I'm not saying it's like, this is just what happened. This is just the history. I'm not making any comment on whether it's right or wrong. Definitely seems kind of wrong to me to force people to, engage in labor, you know, seems wrong to me to like treat people as property and force them to engage in labor and beat them and shit like that, and then sell their children and treat them like cattle. That seems kind of wrong, you know. So maybe you should lose your land if that's what you fucking, if that was the way you made your fucking living. Anyway, but that's just my own personal opinion. So that bred, of course, a lot of resentment. A lot of resentment. People saw these Northerners, these evil, liberal Northerners coming down and stealing their land and, taking away their power and giving it to black people, right? That kind of thing. And it didn't take long for essentially what we would call today terrorist groups to form in order to basically fight Reconstruction, right? And this is a thing that they don't really teach us in American schools. I mean, I don't know about you guys. I don't know. But when I was in school, they didn't teach us shit about this, right? They taught, what did we learn about Reconstruction? Not very much. We learned about carpetbaggers, right? We learned about the Compromise of 1877 to end Reconstruction. But they didn't teach us about how, possibly thousands of people were beaten and raped and murdered during Reconstruction. They didn't teach us about how, white supremacist groups would go around and beat and murder people and intimidate voters and shit like that. We didn't learn any of this stuff when I was in school. I mean, I don't know. Maybe they teach it to kids today. At least I hope they do. But, and I think a lot of the reason, if we did learn about this history, the violent, not so nice history of the United States, if we did learn about all this stuff, maybe some attitudes about race and things like that would be a lot different, So that's another reason why I like doing these streams. It's like I'm doing my part to spread the hidden history of our country, right? Because these are all things that people should know and discuss. And there are things that people to this day will deny. Just ask any fucking lost causer about the Civil War, and they'll deny any of this stuff that I'm talking about here. So anyway, where were we here? Sorry, let me go back. I kind of lost my place. So we were talking about, Reconstruction. Right. So, anyway, the Ku Klux Klan was not the only group, one of these white terrorist groups to come out of Reconstruction, but they're the most famous, and they're the only one that really survives in any real form today. And the Ku Klux Klan started in three eras. They basically have sort of three different phases to their history. And the first phase was during Reconstruction when they were formed. Right. And they started in 1865 by some ex-members of the Confederate Army. About six members of the, 6 officers, right, of the Confederate Army. And one thing that I found interesting, I didn't know this myself, was that they originally were not a terrorist group. They were originally not a hate group. They were actually formed as a sort of fraternity, which was modeled after the Freemasons, and then there was another group that was, another group that they were formed after was, God, did I write it down here? The Sons of Malta. That's what they were, right? And it was basically the Sons of Malta were essentially what you would say the Freemasons are today. Although, reading a little bit about them, I didn't want to go into too much of their history, but they would also apparently engage in paramilitary stuff in other countries, right? So I didn't really read too much about them. That might be an interesting thing to research, but that's basically how they started. They basically started just as a group for these 6 guys to hang out and get drunk and bullshit. Basically that's what, like Freemasons, and they had degrees and And that's where all the weird shit, like in the KKK, comes from. They have all these like stupid fucking like names for their like offices and shit, you know, like the Exalted Dragon and the Grand fucking Cyclops and the Imperial Wizard and all that shit. That's where all this stuff comes from. It's like basically they made up all these like goofy degrees of, you know, whatever for their like fraternity club, right? But it didn't take long for this to become a racist hate terrorist group. You know, basically within 2 years, you know, the KKK started becoming a terrorist group, right? So by 1867, they're already going out and beating up people, intimidating people, you know, lynching black people essentially, right? Lynching black people, and fighting against the, you know, like acting as sort of a terrorist group, an insurgency terrorist group to fight against Reconstruction, right? That was their main thing, you know, they would, and during the course between, you know, 1865 and, you know, the late 1877 or so, right around there, during that like 10 to 12 year period, you know, and they lasted a little bit longer at past that, but by 1877, they were kind of on their way out. During that time, they killed and beat and, you know, murdered and intimidated, you know, especially they murdered possibly thousands of people. Like, we really don't know how many they actually killed, right? But they would engage in all the shit that you think, you know, the KKK does. You know, they would go out and basically, you know, beat up voters, Republican voters. You know, remember the Republicans were the Liberal Party back then. They were the pro civil rights party, right? They would raid whenever there'd be a political rally or something. Like, they'd raid it and start beating people up, shooting people, lynching people, burning down black churches and schools. That shit that even happens today. You know, they really didn't like it when black children were taught in schools, like just taught at all, taught how to read, right? Taught, you know, math, anything like that. They would, you know, assault and rape freaking school teachers, murder black leaders, right? And then they would, you know, when elections came around, they would basically do, you know, voter suppression, right? Extremely violent voter suppression, like, you know, hanging out near the polls with guns, right? To shoot any black people that went to go vote, you know. So this is all stuff like, you know, between, and it was like, you know, there's people like, you know, they were basically the military arm of the Democratic Party in the South during this time, right? Pretty bad stuff. In the election in 1868, right, the election between Ulysses Grant and Horatio Seymour, they killed possibly thousands of people across multiple states in the South, you know, engaging in voter suppression tactics in order to get the Democrat to actually win the election. Of course, they lost. You know, Grant became the president. And apparently Ulysses S. Grant really hated the KKK. Grant was not a champion of equal rights or you know, anything like that, right? He was not a champion of equality or, you know, civil rights or anything. He was extremely racist himself, especially when it came to Native Americans, you know, straight up fucking genocide and shit. But he apparently really fucking hated the KKK, so he's got that going for him. Anyway, this sort of led to, by 1871, the government started cracking down on the first wave of the Ku Klux Klan, right? And they started passing laws specifically to, you know, target them. They're called the Enforcement Acts. And here's actually, let me just copy this thing here. Let me just put that in the chat if you guys want to look those up later. We won't talk too much about them. Those are the Enforcement Acts starting at around 1871, targeting the Klan. Okay. And basically, by the end of Reconstruction, you know, the crackdowns have done their job, and the Klan was essentially destroyed. But it sort of hung around in one form or another, even past Reconstruction. But basically, by 1880, they were essentially gone. They were not the only white supremacist, terrorist group during this time. Of course, there were a lot of different groups that, you know, to nowadays are. I mean, they were essentially indistinguishable from the Klan, but they often, would ally themselves with them, right? One of the most prominent ones was called the White League, right, which was formed right around the same time, 1874, in Louisiana, and they were also made up of Confederate veterans, right? Um, and the thing about the White League is that they didn't bother trying to hide their identities, right? Something to keep a note, though, is that, the notions where you hear about the Ku Klux Klan today, where they're burning crosses and they're wearing the white robes and stuff like that, that was not the original Klan. Didn't do that. But, they did hide their identities. They would wear hoods. They just didn't wear the stereotypical white Klansman robe that you see nowadays. That was actually invented in the 1920s. We'll talk about that a little later. But the White League, yeah, White League was just as violent and, murderous as the Ku Klux Klan, and often would ally themselves with them. Often more than not, people would belong to multiple organizations like this at the same time. So you'd have a guy who was part of the Klan, and he'd also be part of the White League, and then he'd be part of the Red Shirts and all these other groups, right? Kind of like how you have it today. You have guys who are in the Aryan Nations who are also part of the Klan, who are also fucking Proud Boys. It's like the Venn diagram for these people is not very diverse, right? So the thing about the White League, getting back to them, is that they were made up of lots of former Confederate soldiers who participated in the Colfax Massacre in 1873. So a little bit about the Colfax Massacre, right? That was in where did that take place at? God damn it! Did I not write down the Colfax Massacre? It was fuck. You know what? I did write it down and then I lost it. So let's just look that up real fast here. Sorry, guys. Let's see. It was basically Colfax Massacre. Let me just look this up real fast because we can't just glance over that. But blah 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 blah. Colfax Massacre. Basically, I think it was something like goddamn. Well, that's a little bit past the scope of this stream. So here's just a link to some information about the Colfax Massacre, if you want to read that later. Right. Sorry, I should have took some notes on that. But anyway, let's just continue. So yeah, basically, that's who these guys were. Some Confederate soldiers who participated in this massacre, right? And they definitely were very much in favor of using violence and intimidation in order to get their political aims, right? Which was mainly to prevent black people from voting and to get Southern Democrats back into power in Reconstruction governments, right, in the South. That was essentially their goal, right? And they were actually rather successful at it. So that's the other thing that they don't teach us in schools, is that these white supremacist terrorist groups in the the post-Civil War South, the Reconstruction era South, they actually kind of won. They actually managed to accomplish their goals, and that's part of the reason why for 100 years there was, basically Jim Crow in the South, right? And black people were set at second-class citizens and would get, discriminated against and oftentimes lynched and murdered and stuff like that. Nothing would ever happen to the perpetrators of the crimes, This is why. It's because, fucking Reconstruction failed. Right? Reconstruction failed, and the former Confederates who were put out of power managed to get back into power using violence, right? Kind of, the apple doesn't really fall that far from the tree now, doesn't it, folks? It's not like we're not seeing the kind of similar things happening today, right? Anyway, so yeah, one important thing, or I guess one event from the White League was in 1874. They murdered a 17-year-old school teacher, African-American school teacher named Julia Hayden. That was a big thing that I found about them. Nothing like killing a school teacher to make yourselves make your cause look good, I guess. Kind of fucking despicable. They also, in 1874, perpetuated the Kashuta Massacre, which was in Red River Parish in Louisiana, right? And what this was that there were 6 Republican office holders, right? Because remember, the Republicans were the progressive party at that time. And the local chapter of the White League basically ran them out of town, said, forced them to leave the town, kicked them out, right? So they basically gave these guys 24 hours to leave, and then these 6 guys, these 6 Republican office holders, politicians, agreed to leave because they didn't want to die, and then they murdered them anyway. So 6 politicians murdered, right? And that's pretty fucking sad. The biggest thing that that I found, probably the most egregious massacre these people participated in that I could find out was called the Battle of Liberty Place, right? This was in New Orleans also. And what it was that the White League, 5,000 members of the White League show up in order to kick out the Republican governor of Louisiana, right? They faced off against 3,500 state militia and police, right? Remember, the police were kind of a new institution at this time, which they actually have their roots in slave patrols, right? But, anyway, but yeah, they were, trying to keep the peace and stuff like that, right? And then there were another, state militia as well. So this results in this huge battle where roughly 100 people end up getting killed, right? And the fucking Liberty, the White League actually won and occupied the state capitol and the local arsenal and the state house for 3 days. Right? And then they only really withdrew once federal troops were on their way to stop the insurgency. Then they all fucking withdrew. So, yeah, bona fide terrorist group is what this is. If this, can you imagine that happening today? Because see, just a little aside, this last, say, election in 2016, you had shit like this going on. You had right-wing groups in Michigan, for example, and in Oregon taking over federal buildings, that kind of thing, right? And can you imagine this this same sort of thing, 5,000 armed people showing up, taking over a state capitol for 3 days and murdering 100 people, right? It's like, it's kind of insane. It's insane to think that this would happen in the United States, and it's like, it's like if we don't learn from history, we're just gonna repeat it. Yeah, like this time in 2016, they didn't show up with guns and they didn't murder 100 people, but It's not like the shit hasn't happened in the past. And it could happen again, and it's like, and it's the same fucking, the same ideology from back then is still active today, right? Still causing right-wingers to go nuts and do shit like fucking, try to take over the government, invading the fucking Capitol, federal Capitol building and murder senators and shit. It's not like it hasn't happened in the past. Okay? Anyway, so yeah, they kind of won. The White League unfortunately accomplished their goal, and by the election in 1876, the number of Republican voters was extremely suppressed. And basically, the Democratic ruling elite, right, the slaveholders, the former slaveholders, I guess, the plantation holders, shit like that, basically started winning elections again. And by 1877, there were only 3 states that actually, were not redeemed, as these redeemers would call it. Right. There was another group that was pretty worth mentioning, another group called the Red Shirts, right, who were also affiliated with the KKK during Reconstruction. And these guys were in Mississippi and South Carolina, the Red Shirts. I couldn't help but notice the, modern parallel with the red hats that Trump supporters wear. I wonder if that was on purpose, I don't know. Something tells me it's not. Something tells me that your average Trump supporter has no idea about this history, has no clue whatsoever, and is just blissfully unaware about how, like, where all the symbolism and shit that they use comes from. Right? I'm pretty sure the leaders are probably aware of this. I'm pretty sure that, pretty sure that the people who organized the Trump rallies at least were exposed to this history. If they don't, if they're not thinking about it or whatever, I don't know. But I just couldn't help but notice the parallels. It's like when I saw this, it was like, Red Shirts. Fucking, are you fucking serious? And here's the reason why. You guys are going to love this. The reason why they were called the Red Shirts, right, is because the Republican politicians at that time, right, remember, I just want to keep saying this so that people don't get confused. The Republicans were the, progressive party at this point, right, in history. But at this time, they would often make emotional pleas in Congress in order to, pass Reconstruction laws, policies, to continue on policies of Reconstruction, stuff like that. And a couple of them, I couldn't find the guy's actual name. Oh wait, do I have it here? Here it is. Okay. There was one politician named Benjamin Franklin Butler, who was a former Union Army Major General and prominent politician during that time, gave a speech before Congress, right, where he waved he had a bloody shirt, and he said this was from somebody that was lynched in the South, a Reconstructionist worker, politician who was lynched, right? And so that became a thing in the South. People started wearing these red shirts in order to make fun of that speech, right? And it became an idiom where if you were to say someone was waving the bloody shirt, right, then it was kind of like, it had the same meaning as when people say virtue signaling today, so like when right-wingers and fucking alt-right people and shit accuse you of virtue signaling, it's kind of like they're saying that you don't actually care. You're just like talking about this cause in order to make other people think you care, right? It's essentially the same meaning as what waving the bloody shirt was. It's like, oh, you don't really give a shit about these people. You're just waving this shirt around in order to, make people think that, you're just virtue signaling, right? And it's just, that kind of blew me away. Like when I read that, when I read that, I was just like, man, it's the exact same shit that's happening today, right? And it really, really goes to show that the right wing in this country, like the conservatives, the right wing, the the white supremacists, really do not have any new ideas. And they're basically recycling the same shit from fucking literally, you know, 200 years ago. Right? Like, it's seriously like, unfucking believable how, and that completely blew me away. It's like, wow, the parallels that I'm seeing with today are just, uncanny. And damn, I wish people would just fucking like read history. Fuck. I wish they would teach us this in school. If they would have taught us this, when I was in grade school or high school or whatever, if my generation would have been taught this, then maybe we wouldn't have all these alt-right pieces of shit running around today. Anyway, moving on. So that shit was fucking like, uncanny. So like the White League, the Red Shirts they operated openly. They didn't hide their identities, and they didn't really need to because they were basically the ones in charge, They would, engage in the exact same types of voter suppression and stuff like that the KKK and the White League would as well. They were much more open about it, and much more open in their support of Democratic, white supremacist Democratic candidates, right? Seems in particular there was a guy named Wade Hampton that they were really into. And they would go to all his rallies, and they would shout his campaign slogans, which was "Hooray for Hampton." And just imagine, hundreds of people in a political rally wearing red, following this guy around, following around a politician who was basically a white supremacist himself, eating up his every word and shouting his campaign slogans. It's like the more things change, the more they stay the same. Like if you were to take these people and throw them in a Trump rally, they'd just be right at home. Unbelievable. A little bit about this guy, Wade Hampton. He was, of course, a former Confederate officer as well. Came from a wealthy plantation-owning family, and they apparently owned multiple plantations, not just one, but several, which he was in command, or he was in control of before the war started. He was actually already part of the South Carolina legislature before the war started. Of course, once the war started, he resigned and joined the Confederacy because, he was a traitor. That's one thing that we need to remember. When we're talking about all these people, we're talking about Confederate soldiers, shit like that. Please remember, these people are traitors, right? This guy was a traitor. All of these people that we're talking about, they were all fucking traitors. They fought for the side that wanted to overthrow the Union, the United States government. So, not nice people at all. Right. Anyway, Wade Hampton was very prominent after the war in the Lost Cause movement. Personally, he believed slavery was a benign institution, and that it was, white people were just inherently superior to black people. That's an attitude that you still get today, even, where people say that slavery was not inherently evil, and then sometimes it was even beneficial to the black people to come here. You hear that same bullshit today. It's like, oh, the people in America, black people in America, are better off than black people who are in Africa, and we did them a favor by bringing them over here, shit like that. Yeah, big favor. He did you a favor by abducting you and selling you as property and beating the shit out of you and selling your children and then murdering you when we felt like it. Yeah, that was definitely a favor. Thank you so fucking much for your favor there. So yeah, this guy was a piece of shit, Wade Hampton. And the red shirts helped get this guy elected, right, as the governor of South Carolina in 1872. In fact, he was the first non-Republican since the war to get elected to as the governor in South Carolina. Um, Something of note in that election in 1872, that was actually a very contested election. And so this is, remember, this is after the Civil War, 1872. And that was a contested election. And for 6 months after the election of 1872 in South Carolina, there were two parallel state legislatures, right, working in tandem, each claiming that they were the legit, elected state legislatures. So, and that's something to keep in mind, like when we see what's going on today with these recounts and blah, 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 and the Republican recount in Arizona, that kind of shit. It's all the same fucking thing. It's like, it's not like this is anything new. This kind of thing has been happening forever, as long as we've had the United States, right? And especially in the South, it seems. It seems like people in the South, of a certain political ideology don't like losing, and will do everything up to and including violence in order to maintain power. So it's like when you see them trying to recounting ballots and shit and looking at them through microscopes to find fucking bamboo shards on them and all this other ridiculous horseshit. Just remember this is like par for the course. And 100 years ago, they would just start their own fucking state legislature and claim to be the real one. And it's like nothing new from these fucking people. Same shit over and over and over. Right? They do not have any new ideas. They just recycle shit from the past. And maybe that's why they're called conservatives. Anyway, and eventually the South Carolina Supreme Court declared this guy, Wade Hampton, the winner of the election, and he became the governor. So yeah, but the red shirts were also active in elections all the way up until 1900. So this shit just didn't go away once, didn't go away completely once Reconstruction stopped. Although Reconstruction definitely did a lot to kind of, lessen the tensions, I guess. But it still continued. The persecution of, discrimination and persecution against black people in particular in the South, taking away their rights, voter intimidation, lynching, that kind of thing, all the way through the Jim Crow era. It never really stopped. And that's one of the big failures of the United States, really. The failure of Reconstruction to keep these people out of power, has led to problems that we're even dealing with today, right? So that's kind of bad. Anyway, there is a modern neo-Confederate group called the League of the South, which has a sort of a subgroup called the Red Shirts, that pay homage to these fucking pieces of shit. So it's like, that's their legacy. They're not the same group. It's not like the same, there's no continuity of that group to this one. It's just sort of they LARP as they're LARPing as the red shirts or whatever. But yeah, they kind of believe in the exact same shit. So that's fucking sad and depressing, right? There was another group called the Knights of the White Camellia, which was tangentially related to the KKK. Instead of usually people who were in the Ku Klux Klan were sort of low class worker type people, and the people that were in the Knights of the White Camellia, am I pronouncing that right? Camelia, Camellia. Anyway, some kind of flower, I don't know. These guys were the basically the Southern elite class. The landowners, doctors, plantation owners, former officers in the Confederate Army, newspaper editors, shit like that. And, they were against, basically against race mixing, they opposed carpetbaggers, shit like that. And, wanted to restore white supremacy and white control of state governments in the South. So all of these groups kind of together, like it was the Ku Klux Klan and all of these other sort of tangentially related white supremacist, you know, terrorist groups that we would call today, basically. We would call these people terrorists today. You know, all of them together sort of engaged in this years-long low-level insurgency where they would just, they would just use intimidation and violence and murder. They would lynch people, right? Lynch black people. But it wasn't just black people, although black people were the primary target, of their violence. But it was them. It was any sort of northern politician, people that worked during Reconstruction, right? Republican politicians, in particular, school teachers, anyone like that. And more often than not, these people were also the local sheriffs and the local law enforcement, that kind of thing. So someone would get, raped or murdered or lynched. Somebody's house would get burned down, something like that. There would be no investigation, right? And then also a lot of these people, would sort of become the police as well. And you started seeing, black men getting thrown in jail. Lots of the problems that we're still dealing with today started forming during this era. Black people being thrown in prison for bullshit reasons, right? And then Jim Crow laws, laws designed to keep people from voting, right? Things like grandfather clauses and having to pass literacy tests that fucking people today can't even pass. Right? I don't know if you've ever seen one of those, you can find them online. Look up one of those literacy tests that they would enforce. They were no joke. It wasn't just oh, can you read? It was you needed a fucking master's degree in literature and shit. Right? So, and then they would have questions that were purposely misleading, so there really was no right answer, shit like that. I mean, it was all fucked up. This is how that all kind of started, and it started because Reconstruction failed, because white supremacist violence and terrorism basically drove out the federal government. And by 1877, there was another contested election, right? This was the one with, where is it? I have it written down here. 1877, there was what was called the Compromise of 1877, and that was the election between Ruther B. Hayes and Samuel J. Tilden, right? Who, basically they wouldn't let that election go and said, okay, we'll accept the results of the election because the Republican won, right? Ruther B. Hayes actually won the election, and the southern states wouldn't accept it. And, kind of very similar to what we're, experiencing now, isn't it? And basically the compromise, or I also saw it was referred to as the Bloody Compromise of 1877, was that the southern states would accept the election if Reconstruction ended and northern troops were removed from the South. And so the Democrats went for it because they didn't want to start another civil war, right? Just, 10 years later after the Civil War just ended. And that was the end of Reconstruction. And all of the, all of the white supremacists and former Confederates and former slave owners and shit like that who were knocked out of power because of the war, they all regained power and went right back to suppressing, and oppressing black people. They couldn't own them as slaves, but they could do everything else. They could throw them in prison. They could cheat them out of wages. They could prevent them from starting businesses. They could prevent them from accruing wealth of any kind and use them as a scapegoat for all of the problems in their societies. And basically, a lot of the problems we're still facing today is because Reconstruction failed. If they just would have, like, done it the right way and kept these fucking insane people out of power, we'd be living in a much different country today. Anyway, so that's kind of the first iteration of the first iteration of the Ku Klux Klan. It was not just, you know, it was, they were part of a wider, a much wider, you know, I guess, umbrella of white supremacist hate groups at that time, right? So now the second Klan starts roughly around 1910 or 1915, right? And it was founded by a guy in Georgia named William Joseph Simmons, right? So the second Ku Klux Klan is where we get all of the sort of stereotypical things that you would associate with the Klan today. Things like the white robes, the marches, right? The public marches where they would march through town and hold banners, shit like that. You know, the cross burnings, that kind of thing, right? That's where this all comes from. And all of that really wasn't part of the first Klan, although they would wear masks and things and hoods to hide their identity. They didn't really engage in that sort of, you know, grandstanding that the second Klan would, right? And this is because the second Klan, you know, although the guy Simmons, he had some, like, old paperwork, you know, he had, like, some old initiation manuals and shit. Oh, fucking helicopter, sorry, can you, I'm sure you can probably hear the loud-ass helicopter flying by my house. Fucking go away! Hopefully that's not too loud. Anyway, dude, that is, like, so fucking loud. I don't understand. It's because I'm streaming. If I wasn't streaming, there wouldn't be like an aerial fucking rescue battle going on right above my house. Thank you. God damn. Anyway, sorry about that. That fucked me up. So, yeah. What was I saying? Oh yeah. So all of the you know, the sort of stereotypical accoutrements that we associate with the KKK today, things like the robes, you know, the cross burnings, that kind of thing. That all really wasn't part of the first iteration of the Klan, right? That really came from the second, and it was because there really wasn't much of a continuation between the first and second, you know, versions, I guess, eras of the Klan, right? And although there were some old people that still were part of the first Klan, because remember this is only roughly, what, 50 years later, so there were still some people who were alive that were part of the first Klan that joined the second Klan, and they had some of the, like, you know, rituals and initiation manuals and shit like that from the first Klan. The second Klan was largely an invention of it was largely an invention taken from the Birth of the Nation, right? Which was a very popular movie, you know. I'm sure you've probably heard of the Birth of the Nation, right? It was, they teach you about it in film class, if you ever take a film class. And it was sort of like the first big blockbuster. And the Birth of the Nation was all about, you know, the KKK running around. It was about the Ku Klux Klan and how they would defend the Southern honor and blah, 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 and shit like that, right? Racist fucking movie. But important because it was, like, the first of its, like, kind, you know. It was one of the first big, like, successful movies that was ever made or whatever, and apparently the guy that made it pioneered all this cinematic technique and shit like that, so it's, you know, I think you can even watch it on YouTube, I think. Anyway, so yeah, that movie was incredibly popular, and kind of, this is kind of an early example of what you would say, you know, life, I guess, media manipulation, you know what I mean? I guess is one way you would say it, right? What you would say this was. So, yeah, this guy starts his version of the Klan after watching this movie, right? And apparently he, when this movie was shown to him in Atlanta in December of 1915, apparently him and his new Klan buddies basically LARPed as like the fucking hood wearing, like, Klan people from the movie in order to go see the movie. They showed up like, cosplaying as fucking Ku Klux Klan people, right? And that's kind of how it stuck. You know what I mean? Like, that's where it sort of stuck after that, and then they all started wearing the robes and shit, and burning crosses and things. And that was like stuff, because I guess The Birth of a Nation was a book, as well, and that's where it all came from. Like, whoever wrote the book put in the robes and the cross burnings and that kind of thing. And it's like, this guy, thought it was real, and so it became real. Right? There you go. And, they would engage in all of the same sort of, violence, lynchings, cross burnings, stuff like that. But this was also, yeah, like I said, this is the era when they started doing things like public marches and rallies and that sort of thing, right? The difference here is that this guy, Simmons, sort of turned it into a nationwide organization, whereas before the Ku Klux Klan was just sort of like a thing, like they were essentially a lynch mob, that became organized back in the 1870s, right? Here he turns it into a nationwide, organization with professional recruiters who went out, and he made his money through selling the fucking hooded costumes, the white costumes, right? The white hoods and from initiation fees. So for this guy Simmons, like, the Klan was like essentially a fucking money-making enterprise. Right? Which is funny because that's not the only time we've seen that. I mean, when we were talking about the Aryan nations 2 weeks ago, same kind of thing. People were using this shit to make money, right? So yeah, they were very much, very analogous, I guess. Is that how you pronounce that? Analogous. Very analogous to what you would call the sort of, basically Trump supporter today. The America First people, right? Which was also the name of a fascist group, by the way. They preached they were very much in support of what they called 100% Americanism, right? That's an actual quote. I didn't make that up. They were, they would rally against Jewish people, this is where you started getting lots of anti-Semitism from the Ku Klux Klan around this point. And of course, we're very much against black people, obviously. And immigrants of all kinds, including people from Europe. They're very much against people from Eastern Europe, Slavic people, Russian people, people from Lithuania. Lithuania, sorry. Am I pronouncing that right? Lithuania, okay. Anyway, I'm probably pronouncing that completely fucking wrong. Lithuania. All right. Very much against people from that part of the world. Italians, Irish people, right? And which is, something to remember that, during this period, those people were not really considered white. So the definition, when you hear the right wing and they're talking about, race is not a social construct, race is a fucking actual, like, physical differences and blah, blah, blah. Something to remember is that during this period in history, someone from Italy or, Ireland was not considered part of the white race. Right? So, perfect example of how race actually is a social construct. It actually is, Anyway. But, they were also, more than anything, at this point in time, the Klan were very much anti-Catholic, a lot, which that surprised me too. I mean, I knew that there was, myself personally, I knew that there was a lot of anti-Catholic, like, discrimination back then, but I didn't realize how, like, extensive it was, you know? And really, if you think about it, it's because a lot of the immigrants coming from, you know, Southern and Eastern Europe were also Catholics, right? You know, Italians and you know, you have Irish people, Irish Catholics, and you know, that kind of thing. So they basically saw, you know, immigration, you know, and it was the same, essentially the same arguments against immigration that you see today. They're going to steal my job, right? They're parasites. They spread disease. You know, they do nothing. They're lazy at the same time. Like it's like they're going to steal my job, but they're also lazy at the same time. You know, I never understood how that shit worked, but this is the same fucking arguments that you get today. The same things that these people say about, you know, immigration from this, you know, south of the border today. It was the same shit they were saying fucking 100 years ago, right? Um, and yeah, and they really, and also another thing they supported, surprisingly, was prohibition, right? Which was kind of bizarre. You know, because the stereotype that we have, of course, of, you know, the average, you know, KKK person nowadays is of like a drunk, you know, alcoholic racist, like sack of garbage sitting on his front porch trying to bang his sister and sucking down beers or whatever. And it's like, well, you know, kind of goes to show. But you know, the reason why they were against I mean, they were so you know, in favor of prohibition. I guess pro-prohibition doesn't really sound right. The reason why they were so in favor of prohibition is because it was sort of the equivalent of you know, conservative sort of like values voter shit that you would see today. You know, prohibition was sold to the American public as a way of people of like sort of maintaining purity. You know, that was a big part of it. You know, it was like maintaining responsibility and purity, and you know, alcohol leads to lewdness and it leads to premarital sex and shit like that. And so that's really kind of where that support for prohibition came from. It was seen as, you know, plus it was seen as like immigrants get drunk, you know, or a bunch of drunken, you know, alcoholic losers who are just gonna like steal from us. That was another thing. So it's like the same, you know, that kind of goes hand in hand with the reason why they were against Catholics as well, right? But yeah, I didn't know that. That was kind of interesting to me, you know, but it makes perfect sense if you think about it. So anyway, there was, you know, but yeah, they really, really hated Catholics, and apparently um, there were actual groups that were formed specifically to fight the KKK. One of them that caught my attention here that I thought was interesting was called the Knights of the Flaming Circle, who are basically the 1920s equivalent of Antifa. If you read about them, they're actually kind of cool. Let me go ahead and copy this link, and I will put this in the stream also. Dynacat, hey, what's going on, man? Let's see here. So this is the Knights of the Flaming Circle. They're actually kind of cool to read about. They were basically Antifa in the 1920s. They would go protest KKK groups and KKK rallies and throw bricks at them and shit like that. And you know, when they say that Antifa is violent today, right? When they say that the left is violent and they just, you know, blah, 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 because they hit people with milkshakes and shit. Go read about these guys. These guys are straight up fucking like overturning cars, like fucking smashing, like, you know, smashing fucking windows on people, like throwing bricks into crowds. These guys were like mean as fuck. And it's like, damn, like, so, you know, kind of, it's kind of cool reading about them. Like, yeah, fuck yeah, power to the people. Anyway, so yeah, yeah, the KKK during the 20s, and they were, you know, engaged in all of the same shit that, you know, we see today. This is the era where you would get things like cross burnings, right? Lynchings was a major problem. You know, I don't want to get too much into the history of lynching, but it was like extremely bad during this period. You know, people getting lynched like, 2, 3 a day at some point. It was pretty fucking horrible. And the KKK at this point and at this time was behind a lot of that stuff. A lot of, voter intimidation as well. It always kind of comes back to that too with these people, voter intimidation, right? Maintaining political power. Political power goes hand in hand with racism. It just seems like that all through American history. You know what I mean? The easiest and best way to, to oppress someone, the first thing you do is take away their ability to vote, their ability to work legitimately within the system, right? If you can do that, then all the other shit follows that much easier, right? So anyway, where were we? Oh yeah. So by 1923, the group, the Ku Klux Klan started to splinter. The second Klan started to splinter, and there were sort of breakaway groups, and this would eventually lead to them dissolving, the second wave of the Klan dissolving. And this was a splinter group started in Indiana by a guy named David Curtis Stephenson, right? And he was appointed the Grand Dragon of the Indiana Klan in 1923. And this guy was very, very powerful, I'm trying to think of what color I want to make Evil Orko's hands here. Let's make them just gray. There we go. Let's make them these sort of weird grayish zombie Orko. Anyway, yeah, so this guy was extremely powerful, according to Wikipedia here, he was called the most powerful man in Indiana, had friends in high places, that kind of thing. Although he was never he never held office himself, right? Apparently, but he was friends with the governor, shit like that. And, friends with police and that kind of thing. And this guy, David Curtis Stephenson, made a big mistake and raped and murdered a woman named Madge Oberholzer, who was a state education official, right? Apparently, this guy Stephenson had a habit of just serial marriage, right? Where he would just marry and start a family and then just bail and move to another state and start another family and marry, which is against the law, and it was against the law back then, But that was apparently this guy's MO. He would just meet a woman and then marry her and then get tired of her and just abandon her. And you could do that back then because you could move to another state, one state over, and nobody would ever find you, because it wasn't like it is today. They didn't have computerized fucking, you couldn't just look up somebody's address, or you couldn't find out where they lived through a computer database or some shit like that. So it was really easy. This was actually very common, this sort of abandonment. You saw that a lot, during this time, right? And anyway, what it was is that he kidnaps this woman, right? Madge Oberholzer, kidnaps her, holds her captive, and fucking repeatedly rapes her, right? And he bites her on the cheek, right? And that leads to an infection, right? Because this is the 1920s, right? And shit's dirty, right? But human bites are actually pretty bad. If you ever get bit by an actual person, you should go to the doctor, because people have fucking really gnarly, disgusting bacteria in their mouths that you don't want to get into your wound and shit. It can be really, it's worse than getting bit by a dog. Seriously, that's no joke. Anyway, and this led to a staph infection, and he basically would not get her any medical attention unless she agreed to marry him, and she refused, right? So I'm not gonna fucking marry you, guy kidnaps and rapes you fucking 15 times or whatever, And eventually he gets caught, and she dies from the infection because, they didn't have proper, like, they didn't have, like, fucking, you know, proper antibacterial stuff, right? At this point in time. They didn't have, like, fucking penicillin and shit, apparently. And so she eventually dies from this, and he gets charged with her murder. So raping and murdering this woman, right? And during the course of this investigation, so what it was that prior to this, the KKK was actually seen as kind of a fraternal order from people, even though they engaged in white supremacist violence, even though they would lynch people, shit like that. They had a very good reputation at this point, right? Which kind of shows how clueless fucking people really are, and how willing people are to look the other way, when it comes to racism in general. I mean, we still have this problem today where people look the other way when shit doesn't affect them, and are not willing to accept the truth about certain people, not willing to accept the truth about how people who believe in the same political ideas as them are violent, violent murderers sometimes, right? Anyway, so this kind of creates this major scandal, which from the second version of the second iteration of the KKK never really recovers. They, you know, uh, enrollment starts dropping, right? And then, because it kind of comes out during his trial that a lot of the people that were in the Ku Klux Klan, some of the higher members, were like, alcoholics and fucking like womanizers and shit like that, right? And that really damages their public, relations, I guess. People start dropping. At this point, they had somewhere around 3 to 6 million members at their height when this happens. So, keep that in mind, right? Then this guy, Stephenson, as like part of his like plea deal, right, releases a list to the Fed, to the government of all the politicians they've bribed and bought off in Indiana, right? And then that leads to a newspaper. What was it? It was the where I don't actually have the name of the newspaper written down here, but it was a newspaper in Indiana that did several pieces exposing the KKK and all of the politicians, corrupt politicians that they bribed, and like, people they murdered and shit like that. And that really fucks them up pretty bad, and kind of leads to a downward spiral from which they, essentially dissolve. And they've never really recovered to the same heights that they were at since then, right? So by the 1940s, because this leads into huge investigations and politicians start going to jail, shit like that, for being, accepting bribes. And it wasn't always just, the Democratic politicians. There were also Republicans too, because remember, at this point, this is still before the, ideology switch, And, by the mid-40s, they were essentially gone, right? But like all bad, racist, white supremacist ideas, they just get reused again. And by the 1950s, the Klan is back. So there was a good, 10 years or so. And what it was, 10 years without them, and then they come back. And they come back in the 1950s in opposition of the civil rights movement. So at this point, the third Klan is what we call this, right? Hey, Lewis the Hedgehog, how you doing, man? Thanks for joining. So the third Klan at this point were not the same, they weren't really affiliated with the second Klan, not really. Of course, there were always people that sort of like, former members who join afterwards, that kind of thing, right? But they were mainly unaffiliated groups with each other, even, who would all sort of just join under the name the Ku Klux Klan and pretend to be, we're the real Klan, you know. And it's kind of like that today. You have groups in different states, you know, who compete with each other nowadays in order to get members and stuff like that. And all of them claiming to be the real Klan, you know. Although I think there is sort of like a very, very loose kind of like association of the clans nowadays, like, but it's not anything official. Like basically anybody can start, you know, their own local chapter of the KKK, and you know whatnot, because it's like nobody really owns it. Right? Anybody could start it and claim that they're part of the official clan or whatever. And so it's all sort of like been splintered nowadays, right? And basically in the 50s they came back specifically to fight against you know, the civil rights movement, you know, fighting against desegregation, right? You know, during the 50s, that's when they started like integrating schools, you know, so forced busing in schools, which I'm actually against that myself, but for different reasons, you know, but they really hated that. They really hated the idea of inner city black kids, you know, going to school with their children, right? They really didn't like that. The reason me, myself personally, just as a little side note, why I'm against that busing. I don't even know if they really even do this that much anymore, but what they used to do back in the day is that they would take kids from the inner city, right? Black kids, minorities, right? And they would put them on buses and basically bus them 50 miles out to the suburbs so that they could go to school and so that we could have integrated schools, right? And that sounds good, but it's really unfair to the kids who are have to take the buses, because I remember talking about this. I remember when I was in school and like, you know, I was like, why do you guys take buses? They're like, I don't know, right? And I'm like, oh, well, you know, and I found out that like these poor kids had to wake up at 4:30 in the morning in order to get ready to take the bus on time, because it took like fucking 3 hours to do that. And it's really unfair. It's unfair. And the reason why is because, well, you want to have integrated schools. Yeah, that's cool. But, you know, how about you like spend some money on the school, that their local school, and make their local school better, rather than busing them all the way out and forcing them to get up at 5 in the fucking morning, right? To get on a bus and be on the freeway for 3 hours and shit. It doesn't seem fair to me. And I don't even know if they still do this nowadays. I haven't really looked into it. They used to when I was a kid. And I wouldn't be surprised at least some places in the country if they still do this, but it's definitely, you know, I think it's really unfair. And it's like, you know, how are you supposed to study when you're like waking up at 4 in the fucking morning every day? That means you have to be in bed by like 9, you know, 8, 9 o'clock at night. It's unrealistic. And it makes, you know, how do you think someone's gonna like, their academic career is gonna like, you know, progress if they're not getting any fucking sleep? If like half of their fucking day is spent in a bus, you think they're gonna have time to do their homework? I don't know. I mean, we can save that subject for a different video. I kind of went off on a tangent there. But anyway, getting back to the Ku Klux Klan, right? They were against that. You know, they were against integrating schools. They were against, oh shit, what does this leg go to? Oh, this goes to the alligator. Okay. They were against all that stuff, and you know, and they would do things like show up at civil rights rallies and, you know, beat people up, blah blah blah. Same kind of fucking thing. They would try to stop, you know, because during the 50s and the 60s is when there was pushback against Jim Crow, right? And the Ku Klux Klan would try to enforce Jim Crow. So activists would come from the North and stuff and try to like, you know, they'd hold rallies to get laws overturned, and they would do things like register people to vote. You know, they would do things like try to help people pass the literacy tests, that kind of thing, right? And, you know, the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan, and all of these sort of, they weren't the only ones during this time either. There were lots of other little sort of vigilante white supremacist groups that also engaged in this as well, you know, but the Klan was sort of the most famous, right? And they would do shit like, you know, the same kind of things that we see today, you know, the same kind of voter suppression tactics, that kind of thing, right? You know, things like, and they would push for shit like voter ID laws, and they would kick people off of voter rolls and all this stuff, and say it's like, if you can't get time to vote, then that's your own problem, and if you can't get an ID and if you can't pass this test, that's your own problem. And it's kind of like they're very, very similar to the same arguments that you hear from conservatives today, when they try to enact like voter suppression laws like the one in Georgia. Right, when they do shit like this, it's like it's kind of the exact same arguments. Once again, the more it changes, the more it stays the same, right? So anyway, but yeah, the actual organizations though of the Ku Klux Klan, like this time, it never got as organized as it was in the 1920s, right? And kind of from the beginning, the Ku Klux Klan has been a target of the federal government, which I think is a very good thing. Apparently, COINTELPRO from the 60s, right, was very successful against the Ku Klux Klan. So people often, COINTELPRO was used against, progressive activists, anti-war activists, and stuff like that in the 60s. And people think generally COINTELPRO is seen as a very negative thing, and it kind of is. The government should not be, spending money infiltrating peaceful anti-war groups. They just shouldn't, okay? When your group's peaceful, when your group's not a terrorist organization, when they're not bombing shit like that, the government shouldn't be wasting time with them, right? And the thing is, but, COINTELPRO was also used against white supremacist hate groups, the Ku Klux Klan, right? And, for example, and, a lot of these, there was a lot of infighting among Klan groups, all, like, accusing each other of being fucking, like, stoolies for the Fed, of being informants. And that's something that even continues to this day, so it's like, maybe it's not the weapon, it's how you use it. You know what I mean? Like, there is a place for the government to keep tabs on violent groups like this when they have a history of rape and murder and violence. Right? It's just who you use it against. I guess it goes both ways. It's like the same program that brought down the KKK, can also be used for nefarious ends as well. So, what are you gonna do? Anyway, but yeah, the Klan was essentially on its way out. This version of the Klan was pretty much on its way out too, until David Duke came along in the 1970s and sort of gave it a shot in the arm. And David Duke, I'm sure you know who David Duke is. He's a notorious ex-Grand Wizard of the KKK, white supremacist piece of fucking human garbage. Right. And what he did is he tried to make the Klan respectable. He had them take off the robes and put on, suits. And he disavowed all of the lynchings and violence from the past and stuff like that. And tried to reinvent them into being a legitimate, we're just a concerned citizens, we're a separatist group. We don't, we're not a white supremacist group. We just want to support white people, And one thing, this is like, I remember hearing this argument when I was a teenager, like in the 90s, people would talk about white pride, and they would say shit like, well, black people are allowed to have pride, they're allowed to have, be proud of who they are, and gay people have a pride month and all this other shit, blah, 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 blah. And how come I'm not allowed to be proud of my white heritage? And it's like, well, no one says you're not allowed to be proud of it, but you're also not fooling anybody by trying to disguise your white supremacy under the, the nicety of language. That's really what it is. And that's something that we all need to remember, It's the same ideas dressed up in such a way as to make them appear less frightening. The same kind of shit that you get people like Jared Taylor trying to do nowadays with the alt-right. who's telling people like, yeah, you know, look respectable, blah blah blah. Don't show up at the rallies. Don't you know, don't carry like, you know, the fucking Confederate flags and shit like that at your rallies. But when it all comes down to it, he's a Nazi piece of shit, just like everybody else, right? That's David Duke's contribution to the Ku Klux Klan, to try to make him look legit, and it didn't really work, you know. Up until 1999, the Klan was pretty much a non-entity. They were almost gone. There was under 3,000 members in 1999, right? And roughly 29 groups around the country. And unfortunately, that has been reversed. That trend has been reversed, and they're kind of on the rise nowadays. And it's because of the internet. Because the internet allows them to organize and remain anonymous, right? And allows them to reach people, you know, far more people than they ever really could before through normal traditional means, right? And now it's like, you know, for example, Stormfront, the popular, very popular white supremacist hangout on the internet, was actually started by David Duke's ex-wife. She's the one that started Stormfront. And David Duke often goes on there and posts shit from his personal blog there, right? And they use it to organize, and it's like, this is why, you know, you have things like the alt-right today. It all sort of grew out of these early, you know, the early presence of the KKK online, you know. It's sort of given birth to the you know, the modern hate groups, you know. And it's like, so they're kind of back. And in 1999, there were 29 KKK chapters, and there are now, as of 2017, about 190 around the country. And the thing is, they're in every single state, right? They're in pretty much every big city, you know. Although the thing is, 2/3 of all of these chapters are still in the South, the former Confederate states, right? You know, Louisiana, Florida, you know, South Carolina, right? That's where 2/3 of all these groups are. So it's very, you know, although they are very widespread, it's also very much a cultural thing as well. And, you know, like you see, it's just much more prevalent in these same areas. And it's kind of funny. It's like you can take, you know, these states. You could take a map of the Confederacy. You can overlay it with a map of, you know, the 2016 election, right? Or pretty much any election, you know, over the last 20 years. And you can see that, you know, the Confederate states, you can see how they vote. You can see which, you know, which way they lean politically nowadays. And it hasn't really changed very much, you know. And another disturbing thing is that you could take a map of vaccinations, overlay it with these same maps, with a map of the Confederacy, a map of the election, and it's all the same shit. It's like the people, you know, where the Ku Klux Klan chapters are the same states where 100 years ago they were the Confederate states. They're the same states that vote Republican consistently nowadays, you know, because the Republicans are now the conservative party, right? You know, so, right, because they switched over civil rights. I mean, this whole stream we've been saying that, you know, they used to be the liberals, now they're the conservatives, you know. And they're the same places where infection rates for COVID-19 are starting to increase because these people won't take vaccines, right? And it's like, you know, you can almost say that this, you know, racism in general. I mean, I wouldn't say racism, but I guess what am I trying to say here? I guess you could say, you know, it's very much like you can see the cultural divide in the United States, you know, and it hasn't changed very much in the last, you know, 140 years, you know. Has it been 150 years, I guess, since the Civil War, right? Really has not changed very much, you know. the same places 100 years ago where we were having these problems, we still have them today. And it's like the descendants of the same fucking people, right? And I really can't help but think that if we would have, if the federal government would have clamped down a little harder during Reconstruction, done a little bit more to kind of stamp these people out, that maybe we wouldn't have these problems today, Maybe we wouldn't have things like George Floyd happening, where, a cop can just fucking straight up murder somebody and nobody does anything about it for a year. And when they actually do something about it and the cop actually goes to prison, it's like a major fucking deal, right? Like, maybe that wouldn't be happening. Maybe we wouldn't have people like Dylan Roof, going and murdering 9 people in a church, right? Or Heather Heyer getting run over. Or we wouldn't have, white supremacist pieces of fucking shit, losing their fucking minds when, somebody takes down a statue, right? In fact, there's something I want to show you guys here. I want to show this to you. Okay. Let's see. This is, so we talked about the Battle of Liberty Place, back in the, earlier in the stream. That was when 5,000 members of the White League, basically took over the fucking, the state, state house and the state house and the armory and stuff for 3 days and killed 100 people, right? This here, let me just open this up, right? And let me just go to here and let me just turn on, hang on one second, guys. Let me just go and turn on my window capture. Let's see, left monitor. There we go. Okay, can you see that? Let me see. Let's turn that on. Let's turn up. Wrong one. Okay, let's just move that over here. There we go. All right, so this here is one of those monuments. This is a monument actually to the battle that we were just talking about of Liberty Place there, right? Which was erected by the White League, right? And I don't know if you can read that. I wish I can't really zoom in on it further, but let me read this to you guys. Okay, this is one of those monuments that they took down in 2017. And it says this: United States troops took over the state government and reinstated the usurpers. But the national election, November 1876, recognized white supremacy in the South and gave us our state. That's one of those monuments that caused all of, that people were freaking out over, that they wanted to remove. Now, can you imagine that you lived in that town and you're a black person and you had to drive by that town, that every single fucking day, right? This is a monument to people who murdered black people, who murdered, politicians and duly elected officials, people who were elected, right? This is like a monument to a white supremacist terrorist group who went and murdered a bunch of people and drove them out of the state, and then they went and erected a fucking monument to it. And then people today, stake their fucking careers and lose their shit and start riots defending these fucking things. Okay, and then they have the audacity to turn around and tell you that it's not about race, that it's about, Southern heritage and history. Well, this is the fucking heritage they're trying to defend, okay? So I just thought I would bring that up here. All right, now let me just get all of my shit back. There we go. Let me just get all my shit back here. And let's see. Let's turn that off. And if I can just go back to where I was. Wait a minute. Photoshop. Okay. Let's see. Were you able to see that? Okay, I hope you were. Turn off the window capture. Okay. Alright, so hang on. Is this still... No, alright, I have the wrong one on. I need to turn on window capture, turn off left monitor. There we go. Now you can see it. Alright. Anyway, so yeah, I thought that shit was, definitely worth mentioning here. Let's see. Anyway, so yeah, that's pretty much all my prepared material. The KKK is still around, and unfortunately they're growing, And it's important for us to know about it and to stand against these people. Um, anyway, folks, I think I need to, let's go ahead and end this one a little early today. It's about almost 2 hours, but that's okay. And I don't really see any comments in the thing. There's one from Dynacat here. It's a bit surprising that no one has made the Turner Diaries into a movie. Yeah, I think so. I thought there was a Turner Diaries movie. You know what? Now I want to look that up. Let me take a look here. Turner Diaries movie. I'm afraid that Google thinks that I'm like a white supremacist because of all the research I've been doing. Let's see. It looks like there was a short film, educational film from an alternate future. Doesn't look like there was an actual novel, though. An actual movie made out of the novel, so I don't know. I would be sad to see it if they actually did that. I think if they were to make a movie out of that and make it like a comedy and like point out how ridiculous and stupid it all is, I think that could work. If they were to make it like Idiocracy or something. Anyway, I think that's pretty much it, guys. So, yeah, I hope that this stream was educational. I certainly learned a lot during my research of this. About the history of white supremacism, especially the KKK during especially during Reconstruction. I really think if they would have taught us about this stuff, when we were growing up, if we would have known about these things, I definitely think that would have maybe do a lot to kind of stop white supremacism from, taking root in, young people, because it's interesting history. And it's like when you know the history, you can identify the same patterns that are going on today. If you can see, for example, the rhetoric that they used back in the, back then in order to recruit people, if you understand that, if you expose young people to it today and give them this history, they'll be more likely to identify it when people try the same shit to them nowadays, and maybe they won't fall for it. You know what I mean? It's like the best way to prepare someone against extremism is education. So, anyway, I think, okay, well, we're going to go ahead and end this. Thank you all so much, but before we go, I need to do my usual ending thing here. So let's turn on my monitor, right? And let's drag over this guy. Okay, and let's see here. There we go. So if you like what I do and you want to see more, please check me out on social media here. This here is my DeviantArt website. If you like my art and you want to see more of it, check me out on DeviantArt. If you like, also I have a webcomic at hawanja.com, which is fun for the whole stupid family. I just updated it yesterday, so you can see the big fight is about to start. And it's got demons and it's got ninjas and shit like that. So please check me out, hawanja.com. And if you like what I do and you want to support me monetarily, please check me out on Etsy. This is my Etsy shop. I sell scrolls and prints and little monster thingies that I make, like these are all handmade, hand-stained prints. Each one comes out a little different. This is a Lovecraft character. And so if you like what I do and you want to throw a few bucks my way, please consider buying something from my Etsy shop. And if you want to see me talk about non-political stuff, toys and video games and, movies, monster movies, Masters of the Universe, shit like that. If you want to see me talk about non-political things, please check me out on UCD Videos. That's my non-political channel. And I think that's pretty much it. So thank you so much. Thank you, Dynacat. Thank you, Lewis the Hedgehog. And thank you, everybody else who joined. And I will see you all next week. Adios, guys.